Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Expedition Wednesdays, part 2. My name is Jørn, and today we have privileged access to one of the most extraordinary museums in Oslo, the Kon-Tiki Museum, dedicated to the life and history of Thor Heyerdahl Jr., once considered the most famous Norwegian alive. And we are extremely privileged to have the best guide here in the museum, in yourself.
Well, I am Thor Heyerdahl, named after my father, and I've cooperated a lot with my father, although I always tried to avoid following in his wakes or footsteps. Although I would have been interested in becoming an anthropologist or archaeologist, I preferred natural sciences, so I'm an educated oceanographer, marine biologist, and most of my life I've been a professional oceanographer. Being occupied with the sea, I converged with my father's interests again, so we cooperated a lot over the years. I've also been director of this museum for a year. That brought me a little too close to my father. But for 20 years I was chairman of the board. So yeah, my father is probably the best friend I ever had, and vice versa, I think.
Thor, your father and his wife, your mother, returned from Polynesia before the war. After 1 year there. I can imagine that you came along at some point in time.
Well, I was born in Lillehammer, 2 hours north of Oslo, in September 1938. Being a biologist and mathematician, I know that it takes 9 months to produce a human being, including myself. Where were my parents in January? Right there, in that brook. There's my mother and my father, so I suppose that this is the overture of my being.
All right. Wow. And the war came along, and you were an infant. What happened then?
Well, we were in Canada when Norway was invaded by the Nazis. And we had some harsh years in British Columbia before the Norwegian armed forces were re-established in Toronto. And Ontario, and my father volunteered to be trained as a parachutist, and while he was training in the camp Little Norway, we lived in a one-room log cabin. We had a bear cub that we had for a couple of years, grew huge like a bear, ate like a bear, grew like a bear. And we remained in that cabin while my father was sent overseas and joined Russian troops in and helped kick the enemy out of Finnmark. So we had no contact with my father for 3 years, but we were reunited in 45 when I was 7 years old. But during our stay in Canada, we lived in that cabin. My mother slept in the middle of a bed, and my brother and myself, we hugged into the bear to keep warm. So I have literally hibernated with a bear.
Wow. And obviously you might have been a little bit too young to remember details from Little Norway, but that became a very important training ground for the Norwegian Air Force and so on. And I guess Little Norway moved a little bit in Canada, but the start were in what is today near the city center of Toronto, wasn't it?
Yeah, it started in Toronto, but they had a camp north of Toronto in Ontario, in the Ontario forest. And the camp is still there. Now it's a Boy Scouts camp. And I was there a few years ago, and I remembered it so well. It was exactly like it used to be when I grew up. So, well, that's where I had my first, and the very first recollection I have from my childhood was when my father was sent overseas, being trained as a parachutist. My mother asked me to pinch my father, smell him, look at him, and she said, "Look closely at your father now. This may be the last time you ever see him, because he's going to participate in trying to free Norway, and that is risking his life. So look closely at your father now." I never forget that.
Wow, wow, that is strong for a little boy.
Yeah.
But we all know that you got more chances of seeing your father. He came back after 3 years, helping the Allies kick the Nazis out of northern Norway, and that was really perhaps a turning point of World War II, and it ended in 1945. However, he must have brewed on some ideas even during the war, because relatively quick he became very, very active in his explorations.
My mother used to tease my father, charging him from considering the Second World War as a personal insult, because it interrupted my father in his important scientific work. So he resumed his studies as soon as Norway was freed, and started working on his theory that Polynesia must also have been populated from America. So he spent a lot of time in museums, universities around the world, especially in North and South America. So I never really saw too much of my father before I joined him on his expedition to Easter Island in '55. Then I was a teenager, 17 years old. And after that, I've always had very close relations to my father.
I can imagine. Let's dwell a little bit on his undertakings after the war and towards 1950. Obviously, he created a theory or a hypothesis. And in scientific work, you want to try to scrutinize and falsify hypotheses. And a good falsification would have been not to manage it across the ocean with Kon-Tiki. However, that attempt to falsify the hypothesis didn't succeed, and they ended up in Polynesia. But still, that hypothesis was extremely contested all over the world. Can you talk something about how the resistance came about?
Well, a Finnish professor, he claimed that the only thing that the Kon-Tiki expedition proved was that Norwegians were excellent sailors. He didn't know that none of the Kon-Tiki men had any experience at sea. They were all landlubbers. So what the Kon-Tiki expedition proved was how feasible, how easy it was to cross the world's largest ocean drifting on some timber logs. So yes, my father met many challenges, opposition, but he was so convinced that his theory was right, the final truth that he was right, at least partly right, was after he passed away. Now this summer was published a study of the DNA taken in various places in Polynesia and South America that proved even more secure than fingerprints that there has been prehistoric contact between America and Polynesia. And that was what my father was about to prove all his life. But the final proof came after he passed away.
That is fantastic. Because I do believe, and I do remember, when he was still alive, every once in a while he had to answer for this theory across decades. And new researchers would come up and challenge. And now this conclusive evidence have been published in peer-reviewed publication Nature, which is kind of the gold standard for scientific peer-reviewed publications. So that is quite fantastic. It takes decades. And what do you think your father would have thought or said or felt if this conclusive modern DNA had come across when he was still around?
I am sure that he would smile and say, well, what did I say? That's I have spent all my life to prove that I was right, and now I got the final proof that it was the case. My father was often frustrated with all the opposition he met, so I had to tell him that, Papa, you should be very grateful for all the opposition, because without the opposition, you wouldn't have got any publicity, you wouldn't have been able to write any books or make any movies, you wouldn't be able to finance any of your expedition. Remember, a sailing boat sails much better in heavy, strong winds against your vessel. So thanks to your opposition, you've been successful.
That is extremely interesting. What I'm hearing is that you were one of the early public relation advisors to your father. And we know that apart from having this enormous drive, the theories, the ability to connect dots, he was also extremely good at creating enthusiasm for his projects amongst the outside world and decision makers and sponsors and so on. He was a master in that. Can you tell a little bit on how did he muster so much support?
Well, why should anyone in Norway, or for that matter in England or the United States, be concerned with where the Polynesians originally came from? Whether they came from there or from there, from east or west, so what? But my father made it a detective story. He was a terrific communicator, a storyteller, a good writer, and even a good photographer. So it was his ability to make it an exciting puzzle. And that, well, his persistence against the opposition, challenging academia all over the world, all this fascinated. And remember, this occurred 2 years after the war. The whole world was in ruins, fumes steaming out of ruins. Everyone was worn out from the experiences of wartime and disaster and misery. And here comes this adventure, 6 handsome young men sitting on a raft, crossing the world's largest ocean, landing on a coral reef in heavenly Polynesia with waving coconut palms in pace with the waving hula hips of the Vikings. So this was a dream come true. It was very opportunistic that it happened exactly in those days. Had it happened today, when we drive cars on the moon and with all the experiences we have in our days, we're so spoiled. But in those days, before television and, as I say, in the aftermath of the war, the scene couldn't have been better prepared for him.
When you say that, I kind of think back to the Kon-Tiki film, the footage that the men and your father did themselves on that fleet and received an Academy Award for it. In that historical context, right after the war, they were enjoying a freedom that had been non-existent virtually the previous perhaps 5 to 10 years. And maybe you can see it even in their face that they're not only trying to do a scientific work sailing this fleet, they're also enjoying life. What was the atmosphere, do you think, on board that raft?
Well, they had just survived the war. 2 of them were even well-known war heroes from the heavy water sabotage, for instance, in Telemark. So this was, and even my father had participated as a paratrooper up in Arctic Norway. So for the whole crew, this was a relief to get away from all that misery. And my father never understood why he was admired as an adventurer. To him, it was no adventure. It was a pleasure trip. Every single day they had a rough landing on the reef, yes, but other than that, they enjoyed every single day on the raft, and that even strengthened my father's idea that was nothing to it to cross the Pacific on a raft. It was a pleasure trip. If you're sailing up and down the coast of west coast of South America, and you get out of course, if you get caught by a strong wind, well, you'll end up on the other side of the ocean whether you want to or not, as long as you stay afloat. Nothing to it.
Yeah. And in the aftermath of that expedition, obviously the film came out, which became famous. The book came out, and it was translated to how many languages?
Well, I don't know exactly, but around 100 different languages.
The book about the Kon-Tiki expedition. Fantastic. And I can imagine your father became a very attractive speaker around the world because of this. Did he then travel the world talking about?
Yes, he did to begin with, to say restore his financial situation, but I must confess that he made a fortune, and for the rest of his life, he never had any economic problems. One expedition financed the next one. Well, from his talent as an author, especially as an author, but also he was also a good photographer. So it made him independent. He never had to fight for sponsors or supporters from any institution. So, well, that aided him, of course, to pursue his studies completely at his own pace.
And that led him to engage in other expeditions and start in a simpler, in a similar entrepreneurial way. He went on, and the order of things may be hard to understand, but he did a lot after the Kon-Tiki expedition as well. What was the next endeavor?
The Kon-Tiki proved that it was easy to cross the Pacific, but it didn't prove that it had actually been done. My father was, of course, challenged in that respect. So in 1953, together with a Norwegian and an American archaeologist, they undertook some excavations on the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, and found sherds, Indian pottery sherds, proving that at least that far out in the Pacific they had been able to, or the Indians had been able to get it off the coast. Next island out is Easter Island. So in 55-56 he arranged an expedition with a proper expedition vessel with a crew of 16, myself being the youngest as a deckhand, and we spent half a year on Easter Island, and together with 3 American archaeologists and a Norwegian and 2 Chilean archaeology students, we excavated different sites, and it took, I think it was up to 30 years before all the work was published. So again, strengthening his theories. And I could mention many other expeditions in Tucum in northern Peru, again excavating a pyramid site. And after he finished his work in the Pacific, he wanted to see how prehistoric, there had been prehistoric contact between the old world and the new world, Africa and America. So he crossed the Atlantic with the papyrus boat Ra, or the first Ra was not completely successful, but he repeated it the year after, and they sailed elegantly all the way from Morocco to Barbados in the Caribbean. Years after that again, he sailed on reed raft out the Persian Gulf and crossed the Indian Ocean, where I was giving, being an oceanographer, advice as to sailing seasons and current directions and so forth. And he undertook archaeological expeditions to the Maldives, for instance. That was his life.
Oh, fantastic. Standing in front of the Ra fleet that crossed the Atlantic, one of the things that I have read was that there were some findings on this particular voyage that triggered new conventions on the environment and new rules for building ships. So in Viking we are obviously very familiar with the rules for building ships nowadays. And I know that in one way it's linked to this particular fleet and this particular expedition. Can you talk a little bit about how?
At the time when my father sailed across the Atlantic with the Ra, I was an oceanographer, researcher at the Institute of Marine Research in Bergen on the west coast of Norway. And my task at that time was to monitor oil pollution around the world. So we got samples from the entire world, and we compiled the data, and we knew pretty exact how much oil there was spilled into the water globally. An amount of, say, 10 million tons per year, the equivalent of Norway's total oil consumption. And this was published, and nobody read our reports, and it was all forgotten. And here comes my father on this reed ship, and one day dips his toothbrush into the water and gets a small oil lump on the brush and swears in Norwegian. And not only that, complains to Secretary General Utant, who was alarmed, and that initiated publicity about oil pollution of the world oceans. And following that, we got the Oslo Convention, the London Convention, the Paris Convention, all kinds of conventions. And now that problem is particularly, or practically, I would say, solved. So, but me as an anonymous scientist, nobody paid attention but my father with his well-known name, then he gets the attention. Not, I was the expert on pollution. My father was an amateur, but still, it was his observation that ended in a solution.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for showing us around the Kon-Tiki Museum. It's a fantastic collection, and perhaps, or not perhaps, but quite evidently the most important collection of your father's life, the crafts he used, and it tells a really, really nice history. And you really learn a lot. And one of the things I have learned is that Thor Heyerdahl Jr. was from Larvik on the coast of Norway. Larvik, a town that I know as a town of lots of seafaring history. And yourself, you claim that you are from Lillehammer, which is inland. How is that explained?
As you say, Lillehammer is in central Norway, far away from the ocean. And how come that I am the only oceanographer of Lillehammer? I was born and raised in Lillehammer, and the reason for that is that my father, believe me or not, was scared of water. He almost drowned as a young kid on a dramatic occasion. And the rest of his life he fought with this fairness of water. You don't believe that when you consider that he's crossed all the world, 3 oceans on primitive crafts, but he overcame his scareness of water. But when they gave up finding paradise in Polynesia and returned to Norway, he didn't want to settle by the coast again with nearness to the ocean. So he decided to settle in Lillehammer, surrounded by forests and mountains. And that's why I was born in. I was produced in Polynesia. That's a simple calculation, but born in Lillehammer.
Thank you very much. Okay, Thor, thank you very much again. From our viewers, we have received a number of questions. And I have a print of them now. And Jenny from Century City in California has asked, did you ever think about building your own version of Kon-Tiki and sailing it?
Definitely no. I have, although I'm my father's son and I've inherited a lot of his interests, I've never wanted to follow in my father's wakes or footsteps. I didn't want to be a clone or a copy of my own father. So I deliberately chose physical science and became an oceanographer, marine biologist, although I could have been more interested in anthropology and archaeology like my father.
Thank you very much, Jenny, that you got your answer. Valerie from Valley Village has a good question here. How have your father's journeys inspired your travels?
Well, again, I've inherited my father's interests and his affection for outdoor life and adventures in nature. So that's attracted me to the seas. Although I was born and raised in Lillehammer, for some years I was a regular sailor in the Norwegian Merchant Marine. But then I wanted a more intellectual challenge, so I went to the University of California to study oceanography, marine biology, and completed home in Norway, and spent most of my life as an active natural scientist. So definitely I've been inspired by my father, but I want to add that I'm not only my father's son, I'm also my mother's son. And I consider my mother to be more of an adventurer than my father was. In fact, my father considered it an insult to be regarded as an adventurer. He insisted that he was a serious and hardworking scientist.
All right. You share a name with your legendary father. What does that legacy mean to you, and how has it guided your life? Asks Joey from Woodland Hills.
I must admit that at least in younger years, it was a burden. Perhaps not when I was a child. Then I got a lot of attraction for being my father's son with the same name. But say in my teens, when I was asked all the time, are you going to follow in your father's footsteps and so forth, that was a burden and a challenge I was afraid that I would never be able to meet. But after I've finished my university studies and became a professional scientist, and I got a formal degree, which my father never got. So in many ways, I felt superior to my own father. So ever since, it's been 100% pleasure to be my father's son.
Excellent. Here's a good and perhaps challenging question from Joseph in Venice Beach. Do you agree or disagree with any of your father's theories, and why?
I have always been interested in my father's work, naturally, and read his papers and been convinced that he must have been right. Well, not being an archaeologist, not being an anthropologist, still I thought his papers were convincing. But now, as a formally educated scientist, knowing much more than my own father about movements of the oceans and, natural phenomena, I've become more and more convinced. And now, again, knowing much more about being a biologist, about DNA than my father ever did, I'm absolutely convinced that he was right. But I want to add one thing. My father never objected to influence also from the Asian side. He just insisted that Polynesia had been influenced from both the Asian and American side of the ocean. That has been ignored. So I would say that my father and his opponents, they have met halfway between them.
Okay. Thank you. I think we do have time for a last question. And this is a good one, since we've recommended watching the 2012, the new Kon-Tiki film. Marianne from Montrose, California, asks, did the 2012 film retelling your father's story do him justice?
In fact, yes. And I can say, safely say so, because I was an advisor to that movie. So the film was very loyal to my father's life history. So, well, perhaps some scenes were more dramatic than what actually happened, but yes, on the whole, I thought the film came out very well, but the best one was, after all, the documentary that won the Hollywood Oscar, which was technically very primitive, but you felt that you were actually standing behind camera yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Thor, for guiding and answering questions and telling these personal stories. You are welcome on board at any time, and it would be a pleasure seeing you in the future as well.
Thank you. May I finally say that I've been a guest speaker on your vessels on 3 occasions in the mid-Atlantic to the various islands, and enjoyed it so much. May I recommend cruises with your ships.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.